The war in Palestine rages on, and today we're going to be discussing one of the most searched topics in this entire conflict, the idea of a third temple. What does that mean? What was the first and second temple? We're going to be explaining that and how it relates to the conflict as it stands today. And at the end, stick around because we're going to be unveiling how Muslims actually don't appreciate the power of the prophecy of Al-Aqsa in the Quran. But first, let's go to what's been happening in recent months with regards to the Third Temple. Why don't you tell us, Brother Tahir?
So the Third Temple is basically a flashpoint for the religious right in Israelis, in Netanyahu's cabinet, who he's supported by. And what they want to do is they want to take over sovereignty over the Dome of the Rock complex to reestablish the Third Temple of Solomon. So, I mean, one of the most kind of shocking ways in which they tried to signify and signal their intention to do this was in May 21st, 2023, so about a year ago, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's remarks at the start of the festive cabinet meeting in honor of Jerusalem Day. We've just had Jerusalem Day 2024, so almost exactly a year ago. Okay, which was held in the Western Wall tunnels, at which several decisions were made to develop and strengthen the city. So, they all know about Hamas's tunnels, right? But they like to build their own tunnels underneath the Western Wall, underneath the complex, so-called to do archaeological investigation
for the first temple.
For the first and second temple. But a lot of people have said that actually it's there to undermine the foundations, and it is undermining the foundations of the complex.
Can you very briefly just tell us, what does that mean, this complex? Well, what is there?
So basically, it's a big square, right? It's a quadrangle. And in the middle of it, towards the southern end of it, sits the Dome of the Rock shrine. Now, it's not a mosque, okay? It's actually a building that was built around the site where a lot of Muslims believe that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, ascended to heaven from. And we're going to cover that in a little bit more detail, whether that's true or accurate or not, okay? And then towards the northern end, there's the Masjid Al-Aqsa. Now, the Masjid Al-Aqsa is a mosque that was built later on after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, peace be on him.
Peace be upon him.
And that is a mosque, okay, that was built in the time, I believe, I don't know exactly when, but I think it was built in the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik. Okay. So is that correct?
Very early on, but the thing is, the current structure that we have is not exactly what was built.
It's not exactly what was
built. It's been built, rebuilt, and at some one point it didn't even belong to the Muslims.
Okay, fine. Yes, of course it belonged to the Crusaders for a good period of decades. So that's basically what the complex is, and part of that complex is the Western Wall, and that complex is thought to be where the first and second temple were originally.
Which, brother, the mirror is going to be going through. So what was happening? I mean, can you just show us some pictures if you scroll down? Of this meeting. Wow.
Yeah, so this is literally this isn't like in a room in like the Israeli parliament. This is, you can see stone buildings.
This is the cabinet, right?
This is the cabinet, meeting and having a cabinet meeting on Jerusalem Day underneath the Western Wall, basically in the region of that whole complex. And so what they wanted to do is, this was in response to ostensibly, and their claim was, this is in response to Mahmoud Abbas saying that the Jews don't have any connection to the complex. So they decided to kind of stamp their authority on this issue by holding this meeting there. And this is also signaled by this, explained by this article. Netanyahu holds provocative cabinet session underneath Al-Aqsa Mosque.
It's from the cradle.
This is from the cradle. And a few days ago, PA leader Mahmoud Abbas said the Jewish people do not have links to Jerusalem and Al-Haram. Therefore, I'm telling him that we are holding our meetings today in the depth of Jerusalem and its Haram, the Israeli premier said during the meeting. I mean, I'd be very surprised if Mahmoud Abbas said that, because most of what comes out of Netanyahu's mouth is a lie. So, I think...
But if it did, then...
I also doubt whether he would say such a thing like that, because it's well known the Jews have a historical connection to Jerusalem, right? And in fact, it was the Muslims who brought the Jews back to Jerusalem, which we're going to go through as well.
And if he did say it is mistaken.
And if he did say it was mistaken anyway. The tunnel in question is located under the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound's Al-Buraq Wall, also known as the Western Wall. This is the first time since 2017 that the Israeli government has held a cabinet session in the tunnels underneath Al-Aqsa. So this is something they've been doing. Right? So this is 2017, then 2023.
And I can see it says, ahead of the cabinet meeting, Jewish supremacist National Security Minister Ben Govt entered Al-Aqsa in one of his regular raids of its courtyards and declared that Israel was in charge of the site. And I think we've got an article actually which shows how this was like a year ago. That actually happened more recently. Why don't you walk us through that as well?
So this is on April 18th, 2024. Israeli Knesset member calls for building of third temple at Al-Aqsa Mosque. a far-right member of the Knesset, Israel's parliament, has called for the building of what he calls a third temple in place of the Al-Aqsa mosque complex in occupied East Jerusalem. I really hope that all the Jewish people have to come next week on Monday to offer their Passover sacrifice in Jerusalem, and it explains what that means. And I think this is much more profound for this whole conflict in Gaza, because the whole reason this began was ostensibly October 7th.
Yeah.
What people forget is what was October 7th called.
Yeah.
It was called Al-Aqsa flood. That was the name given by Hamas, by Islamic resistance,
Al-Qassam brigades.
Yeah, the Al-Qassam brigades, the different militant factions that exist. The operation on October 7th was called Al-Aqsa flood. And it occurred in response to a very large number of Jewish individuals, rabbis, or ultra-Orthodox individuals going through the Masjid al-Haram complex in a specific ceremony. I remember they were holding what were they holding? Green stalks. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and they do this on a regular basis. It's not just necessarily, this is ceremony, again, it's just to show off their kind of their power and their control of the Al-Aqsa complex. But generally as well, we know Ben Gvir on a regular basis called for raids and sieges to take place at Al-Aqsa mosque itself, inside it.
Wow.
And we see this in the yearly occurrence where during the month of Ramadan,
Yeah.
the Muslim believers or the worshippers who are praying there are being attacked during the time of prayer itself, which is absolutely bizarre for us to even think about, because the month of Ramadan is a month where we seek peace and comfort and content, but they're the ones who are being targeted.
Okay, so what we're saying is that actually members of the Israeli parliament, Ben Gvir, as well as others, are kind of openly calling for a third temple to be created at what is considered one of the holiest sites of Islam, at this, at the temple, around the Temple Mount, or in the Al-Aqsa compound. Right?
Yeah, so Ben Gvir does not shy away from the fact that he openly claims that this belongs to us.
Right, and that's so significant, because the whole context of this conflict and the entire region is the settler colonialism, as it's been called, of Israel over Palestinian land. So it's like, not only have we taken all this land, but we're going to continue taking one of the most significant sites. In a way, one of the last things that the Muslims actually have there. So you can imagine the emotional power that kind of threat has to the local Palestinian population. Now, I think I think it's worth going into a little bit more about how this political movement and this religious political movement developed. So could you walk us through a little bit of that? And then we're going to come to Brother Damir, who's going to go through the history, because I know some of you are probably thinking, I still don't fully get, what is the Temple Mount? What does it mean? Al-Aqsa, what is this? We're going to go through all of that, but we're just going to go through some of the political developments first. So can you summarize some of that, please?
This is an article explaining the Israeli extremists who want to rebuild the temple and the government ministers who back them. And basically it just goes through a long history of how it is that this temple movement came about and how it became prominent in Israel today. And the way it basically happened is that you had, initially it was a fringe view of the ultra-Orthodox right, and it became mainstream by an individual who claimed to have had a spiritual experience, and then it eventually became much more prominent with this individual here. So his name is Yehuda Glick.
Okay.
And he started talking about entering onto the Temple Mount and being important for the Jews as a matter of human rights. And he started framing it in terms of the religious right that a person has to worship where they wish. He was also considered to be a bit of a fringe lunatic by many in Israel, especially the secularists, until he was shot in 2014, and then he was started to be seen as a
martyr for the cause.
As a martyr for the cause.
Okay.
That's right. And then what they basically done is this group that he kind of leads or is part of, this temple movement, they started to basically capture government.
Okay.
Right. They started to get in bed with people in the government, installing their own people as politicians who are sympathetic to their view and advocates for the temple position. And they held these regular yearly conferences called the temple conferences, in which they bring together the political class, the religious class, and everybody, to bring them all together to kind of fire up the base, to try and hope that soon the Messiah will come once they build the temple.
Right.
So that's basically the long story short. And this has a strange kind of symbiotic relationship with the Christian Zionists, who also want to see the formation of the temple.
So, I mean, this is interesting, because even there's an evolution within Israeli society, which is reflected in the government, which is that the previously more hardline Zionists, who have a much more of a religious basis, seem to be growing in their power and their influence, and have now infiltrated, if you will, government, and are starting to shape policy.
Yeah.
So Ben Gvir is an extremely important, isn't he head of Mossad as well?
No, he's the finance minister.
Was the
isn't he?
interior minister, but he's a significant member of parliament in Israel.
Minister of National
National
Security.
Security,
That's right.
So this and
It's Smotrich. Smotrich is the finance minister of Israel. He's the treasurer.
right, and is he another quite hard line?
Yeah. He's a real
Temple.
He's a real temple fanatic. That's right.
Gentlemen. It's almost like this is like a red line. This is like a tripwire between what little is remaining of Israeli-Palestinian relationship is a kind of
There's much left, mate.
yeah, not after this war,
Yeah.
but especially prior to this,
true.
is that there was a degree of sanctity allowed for the Al-Aqsa compound, that the Muslims were allowed to pray there, that the Jews didn't have a kind of free roam there. It was, it had an emotional power there. And if now there are people in government who want to destroy that potentially, right, and build another temple there, the Muslims are going to be what's left. And to your point, you were saying this earlier, this is probably part of why this whole the operation was called Al-Aqsa flood, right? This is now the totem, if you will. There's another word for that.
Yeah.
The mascot. This is now almost like the mascot of the Palestinian cause, the sanctity of Al-Aqsa. So I think it's really significant that these changes are happening. Let's now go to Brother Demir. Why don't you walk us through where this all comes from? Like, first temple, second temple, third temple. How do we get to this point where in 2024, Israeli politicians are calling for the destruction of this site and a new temple to be built there?
Because I think part of it is also people are talking about how complicated this issue is, Israel-Palestine. And they don't talk about that with other wars. And I always found that interesting, that this is sort of settler colonialism. This is, massacres upon massacres across decades. And yet people still talk about it as being really complicated. And I think part of it is the religious aspect of it that people just don't understand. And I think some of the temple stuff that we're talking about now is part of that.
Well, demystify it for us then.
Yeah.
That's what our channel's here for.
So these temples. So the first temple is mentioned in the Old Testament. So this was a temple that was built at the time of Solomon, who was a king and a prophet during the time. So this was around 1,000 years before Jesus.
So post Moses. So he's a Jewish prophet and Jewish king.
Exactly, a Jewish prophet and king. And so he built this temple for the Jewish people that stood for around 300 or 400 years. And it was, I guess, the hub of Jewish activity at the time. But it got destroyed by the Babylonians during a siege that happened. And this was in around 670 BC.
Yeah.
And then within the next few decades, that temple was rebuilt. And the rebuilding of the temple was called the Second Temple.
Okay.
And it was rebuilt by the Persians. So the King Cyrus, who led the Persians at the time, came and basically enabled this second temple.
The Iranians rebuilt the Second Temple.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. And over the coming decades and centuries, this Second Temple grew and grew. And again, it became a hub of Jewish worship, Jewish activity, sacrifice, meeting up, gatherings, all of these kind of things.
Yeah.
And it remained even at the time of Jesus. There was this Second Temple in Jerusalem. And there's very famous scenes in the New Testament, very famous accounts whereby Jesus overturns things in the temples. He accuses the temples of the people in the temples of using it in order to make money rather than to demonstrate true spirituality.
So this is the site of all of those
Exactly.
famous scenes with the prophet Jesus. Wow, that's
A lot of the accounts of the gospel are based in the temple, and even the significance also lies in modern day Jews, is because nearly half of the accounts of the Old Testament are within that 300-400 year period of the first temple as well.
Right.
So this is why this is very, very important to us, the as well.
And I think the widespread understanding of both the Jews and now the Muslims is that the destruction of the temple first time was a punishment for the Jews, right?
Yeah, even the Jews don't accept this, and they view that as the case.
Right. So the temple,
but they don't view that as the case with the Second Temple.
That was just unfortunate. The timing was a coincidence. So the first temple was actually destroyed for their sins, if you will, and then rebuilt after a period of time. Second temple was recreated after a degree of repentance, I guess, and accepting Ezekiel and the other prophets.
But within 40 years of Jesus' crucifixion, in 70 AD, the Second Temple was destroyed. So this was destroyed during the war with the Romans, and it was the Romans that destroyed that temple.
Okay.
And unlike with the First Temple, whereby it was rebuilt only a few decades later, the Second Temple has never been rebuilt. And so it's been a cause of confusion perhaps, and, maybe sadness that this temple has never been rebuilt again. And throughout the years, there's been this concept of a third temple. And this third temple is supposed to be linked to the end times. So the fact really is that the Messiah, according to the Jews, will come and he will build this third temple, and it will be a source of grandeur and it will be a source of greatness for the Jewish people. This hasn't happened yet. And I guess part of this backdrop is that many people, Jews and also Christians, see the time that we're in now as being like the end times. They see signs of the end times as prophesied in Jewish and Christian scripture, and therefore they're waiting for this temple to be rebuilt.
Let's pause there. And before we go on to the current times, let's talk a little bit about that second temple and its destruction. What is the Christian and the Muslim view of why that happened? And what happened to the Jews in Judea at the time? How did that all play out? Can you summarize some of that for us?
Yeah, so I mean, the Christian and Muslim view is that Jesus was their Messiah who came to reestablish them in a spiritual way. And the teaching that Jesus basically gave is that when you subjugate your spirituality to other people, and when you become spiritually corrupted, then God will place above you worldly. God will dominate you with other worldly people, with worldly powers. Okay, when you, in a way, don't give heed to your spiritual requirements, then God will take away your ability to fend for yourself and to lead yourself and to have your own nation as well.
So when you reject God as your spiritual master, he will give you worldly masters to rule over you.
That's a much more eloquent way of what I was trying to say. Thank you.
An example of this you actually find in the destruction of the first temple. So
Absolutely.
A lot of the accounts that I mentioned in the scriptures are not necessarily just stories, they're lessons to learn from. And if Jews believe that the destruction of the first temple was due to their objection to prophets and to God himself.
And idolatry.
Exactly. And this is why it was destroyed. Then surely they should reflect over why this has happened a second time.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's a very good point. So the Christian and Muslim view is exactly that by the rejection of Jesus, their Messiah, to bring them back to God, who God then therefore destroyed the symbol of their religious authority in the center of their religious power.
Because it became an idol.
Because it became an idol.
Right.
Correct.
And God said, no, my Messiah has actually come, follow him, following your temple, which is your religious establishment.
Yeah.
It became a symbol of their religious establishment, of the Pharisees and Sadducees, who rejected Jesus for essentially their own worldly power.
Yeah.
So,
they weren't using the temple for like noble, pious religious activity. They were using it for business purposes or for enriching themselves.
It's what they're doing now to further their political agenda.
And sedition.
Good point.
Sedition.
Yeah.
Sedition,
Extremism.
zealotry, extremism, terrorism.
Yeah.
The zealots were, they're a hardline religious group who used to go around stabbing Jews, but also Roman civilians, killing them in the streets and killing Roman soldiers in the streets as well.
Yeah.
They were basically the terrorists of the day.
And what's our view on, did the Jews convert? Did they mainly convert? Did they partly convert? What happened to the Jews in Jerusalem at the time?
So as a result of the destruction of the temple and those punishments, the vast majority, especially in the eastern parts of the world, in Asia in particular, they became the Jewish followers of Jesus. They accepted the Messiah.
Yeah.
Right.
And we have a video on that
and
about Jesus in India and the intelligent design of Jesus' crucifixion. So go check that out. We'll put a link into that in the corner.
Yeah.
Or
And
below,
the
or somewhere.
idea that the Jews were then, that they were removed from the land of Judea is a falsehood.
Okay.
They weren't removed. They didn't magically disappear. They were the peasants, the Jewish peasants. They're all still there, and they maintain their position there. A lot of them would have accepted Jesus and did accept Jesus. And then when the Prophet Muhammad came, whom Jesus prophesied, they became Muslim, and they're who we know as the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Okay. So the Palestinians today are the descendants of the Galileans. Okay, of the Canaanites, who were there at the time of Jesus, peace be on him. They're mixed in with Arab blood now because they also were conquered by the Arabs. And then that's how they mix in. The best examples, and we've covered this in one of our videos as well, the best examples of genetic purity going back to the time of the Canaanites is the Palestinian Christians.
Yeah.
Because they are from
Samaritans.
pre-Islam, and they didn't intermarry with the Arabs who are Muslim.
But that's a big topic.
That's
so
a big topic.
We have covered that. And, you mentioned, for instance, Jewish peasants. That was the phraseology of the founders of modern Israel who talked about the Felahin and said that...
I wasn't using it disparagingly. I was using it in
It was a callback. It was a callback to our previous video.
To Ben Gurion himself, the founder of Israel, how he described how him and his associate, I can't remember his name, wrote in a book about the Falahi.
He's the Engel of Marx.
Yeah, yes. So how they were represented. The Jewish peasants of Judea remained on their farms, on their pasture lands, and they continued to cultivate it for centuries.
But some Jews presumably did continue to reject Jesus, right? I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
most of them we can say, and it's fairly obvious, converted to being Messianic Jews, and 6 centuries later, 7 centuries became Muslim.
Yeah.
Right. But some of them would have stayed as Orthodox Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, right?
Yeah.
So what happened to them?
Well, some of them were still there.
Yeah.
And some were expelled. And there was what we know today as the Ashkenazi Jewish population from Europe. A lot of them are converts, and they are the descendants of converts
Right.
to Judaism from various different tribes and various different peoples who converted to Judaism over time.
Okay.
So it's not as simple or as straightforward as every single person who calls himself Jewish today is a descendant of somebody who lived in the ancient land of Canaan, right? And who has ancient, historical roots going back to the time of Solomon. It's just not the case.
Yeah. Okay, so just to summarize that, and then we're going to continue. You had 2 of the 12 tribes of Israel in Judea at the time. Jesus comes. Initially, they don't really believe in him, but then they eventually do believe in him. Most of them, or rather, many of them convert, become Messianic Jews, right? So then you've got some who believe in Jesus, some who don't. Those who don't believe, a lot of them are destroyed, killed in Jewish-Roman wars, okay?
Yeah.
So then you've got an even smaller segment of Orthodox Jews who continue. Some of them stay in the area, and some of them leave and end up intermixing, converting with Europeans, and they kind of form a lot of the Ashkenazi Jews at the moment.
Yeah.
And some of the Orthodox Jews stayed in that area, while the Jews who believed in Jesus later became Muslim. Okay,
Yeah.
Hope that's followable for people, because I think that's important, because it gets very confusing, because you have you expect the Jews now or the Jews then, or the Muslims now or the Muslims then, but actually people converted, people changed over time.
Yeah.
So why don't we now then get to the Third Temple, and how did the ideas of that develop after the war?
Yeah, so there was the 1967 war, and during this war, the Israelis, they managed to capture quite a bit of East Jerusalem. And because of that, there were thoughts by the Israelis that actually this is the time that the Third Temple is going to be built. This is the time that the Messiah is going to come. And so they were all kind of waiting for that. I've got a quote here, actually. One of them said that even one chap, I think he was called Israel Ariel, who was one of the key players in this. He said that he arrived at the Western Wall and he saw 2 rabbis and teachers. We embraced and stood with tears running down our cheeks, sensing that the Messiah was still on his way. It would just take another hour or 2. So they really thought that after this war, the Messiah would come, and it was imminent.
Because the Jews had captured Jerusalem.
Because the Jews had captured Jerusalem, exactly. Right. And sort of full information on this and the full quotes and all of this is on the Rational Religion website. We've got one of our writers, Atar Waresh, has written a very, very good article about all of this, summarizing it in detail. But after this, obviously the Messiah didn't come.
Yeah.
And they were waiting and they were waiting until years went by. And this chap Ariel, he was extremely affected by the fact the Messiah hadn't come. And he essentially, there's another quote by him, and he said, I turn to the left, I turn to the right. Where is our just Messiah? Where is the Messiah of the end of days? Why is the sound of the news delayed? And a heavenly voice reply, how can I come when the temple is in ruins? Hew the rock and build a house of glory. So what he's essentially saying is, how can the Messiah come when the temple hasn't been built yet? So he's sort of twisting the original Jewish thought, which was the Messiah would come and build the temple. And he changed it to suggest that actually they needed to build the temple first, and then the Messiah would come, because the Messiah would only come if there was a grand temple ready for him.
Okay.
And I guess this is where what you've talked about with regards to the temple movement, how that started to be developed. So this idea has become more and more within the mainstream realm that actually they need to build the temple first.
Now, I find that slightly confusing, because from at least my perspective as a Muslim, it's fairly clear from our perspective that Jesus was their Messiah, and therefore the Jewish dispensation essentially ended with him.
Yeah.
So how can there be prophecies of a third temple? Is there good evidence that there were prophecies about a third temple being built, and that this is something that the Jews should do? You know, where does this kind of come from?
So there's not good evidence. I think perhaps you know about it better, Brother Hon, but I think it's sort of interpretations from Jewish scholars of the past, that there's particular biblical clips that talk about it talks about sort of the you mentioned it perhaps.
Yeah,
the glory
it's the
of,
same way as
Yeah.
we were just talking about the interpretation of this person here, that when you capture Jerusalem, the Messiah will come.
Yeah.
Messiah didn't come.
Yeah.
You also need to build a temple, then the Messiah will come. So making up interpretations or understanding as you go along.
Yeah.
Right? In the same way, there is obviously the Jews, the Israelites, they believe that they're the chosen people of God, they're the only chosen people of God. And
The
for
Jews and the Israelites are two separate things, but anyway, go on.
I'm saying the Jews currently say the Israelites are the chosen
Yes,
people
yes,
of God. And for that reason, God will always favor them. And for that reason, currently they're suffering. The Messiah has to come. And then the temple signifies glory and power.
Okay.
Right? As well for them. So for that reason, there has to be a temple. And a temple needs to be there for them to fulfill a lot of their ritualistic rites as well.
There's a biblical quote, I think, that says the glory of the present house
Will be greater than the previous
glory
house.
of the former house. And I think they used some of that in order to suggest that.
And that was at
actually-
the point when the temple was destroyed.
Yeah.
So
Was that the time of the first or the second temple, though?
Oh, that's a good question.
Because that could have been a prophecy about
Yeah.
the second temple, right?
Yeah.
And then the question does need to be begged, which is that, well, you know what? If they wanted a Messiah who could come when the temple was already there, well, hey, was there a Messiah who came when there was already a temple? I can't remember. Oh no, yeah, there was. There was an individual who claimed to be the Messiah at the time when there was a second temple.
Okay, so I have two very learned people here, and the only quotes that you could find as sources of a third temple was this idea about the glory of the power of the house, which to me does not seem at all definitive about a third temple at all. So I think you're right that actually, if there are any prophecies about the Messiah, they were clearly fulfilled in Jesus.
Yeah, because after he came and he was rejected, the temple was destroyed.
Yeah, and and so many of the people who rejected him were wiped out in the Jewish-Roman
Yeah,
wars.
there's 300,000 the Romans killed.
Yeah.
You know, it's not it's huge. It was a massacre of unbelievable proportions. The very interesting thing is we have in the Bible, it talks about how the followers of Jesus, the Jewish followers of Jesus, knew that it was going to come.
Yeah.
That this massive cataclysm upon their people.
Yeah.
And they were told through dreams to go and travel and move out of Jerusalem to a town called Perea. Okay, which is in the region, and they went there, and while they were there, then the Jewish-Roman War struck in 70 AD, the first Jewish-Roman War, and that's when the temple was destroyed.
Okay, so I am now even less convinced that there's any good biblical reason to believe in a third temple being built. It really does seem like Jews trying to post hoc rationalize why the Messiah hasn't come, and they keep on adding conditions. Okay, we captured Jerusalem, now the Messiah is coming? No. The heavenly voice said, I need to now build the temple. And then Jesus will come, right? And we're going to see this with the red heifer stuff as well in our next video, where then the red heifer stuff needs to be fulfilled as well. So there's this trend of, we just need to do this, then God will save us. Whereas actually, perhaps the reality was they need to accept the Messiah when he came, and they've missed the boat now.
And absolutely, and the Messiah who came at a time when the temple was already there.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So because he was already, so that actually would have fulfilled their current, need or desire that there should be a temple and then a Messiah.
Yeah.
And then the temple was destroyed after he was rejected, signifying that was the true Messiah for them.
But also this trend of needing more things to happen inevitably deteriorates into actually committing more and more atrocities.
Right.
So, for example, destroying Muslim sites, presumably killing Palestinians, all of these things, I guess, are part of this wider project by these religious extremists in order to trigger and hasten the coming of a Messiah.
And it's very convenient as well, isn't it? For the political side of things, that, they can use a religious justification essentially to grab power and land and wealth.
Yeah.
Very convenient.